Hello Zero Books readers, it's me again, Douglas Lane, and in this video I'll give you all the facts about our recent run-in with YouTube's censorious algorithm. I'll take a look at Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman's propaganda model, read an excerpt from J.A. Smith's book, which is coming out soon, Other People's Politics, reconsider some of the ideas of the liberal political commentator and amateur philosopher Walter Lippman, all as I try to figure out our way forward in this highly censored. In 1988, Noam Chomsky and the late Edward Herman co-wrote the book Manufacturing Consent, a book wherein they put forward a theory of social control based on what they called their propaganda model. They began their argument this way. Quote, "The mass media serve as a system for communicating messages and symbols to the general populace. It is their function to amuse, entertain, and inform, and to inculcate individuals with the values, beliefs, and codes of behavior that will integrate them into the institutional structures of the larger society. In a world of concentrated wealth and major conflicts of class interest, to fulfill this role requires systematic propaganda. In today's digital media environment, where 300 hours of video are uploaded to YouTube every minute, with 2 billion active Facebook users and 6,000 tweets going out to Twitter followers every second, this old critique of centralized corporate media seems irrelevant. While it's true that only a few corporations own the digital platforms that matter most, we are still experiencing an exponentially expanding array of mediated messages. The diversity of content available online is so vast that it seems impossible to think that any coherent set of values, beliefs, and codes of behavior could arise from it. In 1988, if I wanted to see something completely random, say a cow wearing a crown of thorns, I would probably have to either draw the picture myself or visit the local Hindu Christian cult and wait for Easter. Today, all I have to do is type the words into Google and... Okay, so not everything is available online today. In fact, one of the things that is not available online is the video Ben Burgess made for us back in February entitled Ben Shapiro is Wrong About Israel, Anti-Semitism, and American Jews. A few weeks back, YouTube removed the video for violating community guidelines.
If you create content for YouTube, it's important to understand our community guidelines, common sense rules that anyone using YouTube needs to follow to keep their videos and account in good standing.
The reason behind the removal of our video criticizing Shapiro's position regarding the rights of Palestinians and his sweeping generalizations about American Jews is unclear at this point. It's worth noting that the video was flagged and suppressed back in February. At that point, we appealed the decision to put the video behind a content warning screen and suppress the video from being recommended. We received what was called a manual review at that time, but to no avail. Presently, we've been told by a YouTube representative that our new appeal regarding the removal of the video has been escalated and that we'll receive another manual review. An answer is supposed to be forthcoming in the next few days, although 5 days have already passed. But we're not expecting that a more advantageous outcome will be forthcoming this time either. One of the reasons we have no expectations that we'll receive a more rational decision from YouTube is because we don't have any idea what criteria is used to judge a YouTube video during a manual review process. All we know for sure is what the guidelines are, and that by any rational standard, our video didn't violate those guidelines. This video being taken down isn't a big deal for us. It wasn't getting those all-so-important clicks anyhow, and the arguments in it can be found in hundreds if not thousands of other places. The reason I'm bringing this up isn't because there's an emergency for Zero Books, but because I think the removal of this video is symptomatic of a bigger problem, and that brings us back to Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman. While many centrist liberals at the time claimed that they were touting a conspiracy theory, Chomsky and Herman's propaganda model was, in fact, a description of the, quote, routes by which money and power are able to filter out the news fit to print, marginalize dissent, and allow the government and dominant private interests to get their messages across to the public, end quote. Given the character of the corporations that own the social media platforms we have all come to rely on for our news today, this propaganda model may still be relevant after all, despite the diversity of content that finds its way to the internet.
So would you work with us in terms of what regulations you think are necessary in your industry?
Absolutely.
Okay, would you submit to us some proposed regulations?
Yes, and I'll have my team follow up with you so that way we can have this discussion across the different categories where I think that this discussion needs to happen.
Look forward to it.
It's been widely reported that YouTube is combating fake news by pushing videos from credible sources to the top of the recommended video list, while suppressing videos from fringe sources that might be pushing misinformation. However, the only way that YouTube has to distinguish between credible and fringe news sources is to refer to the norms and values that already define the center of American politics and debate today. And there are many examples from the not-too-distant past where fringe positions turn out to be the true positions as against received opinion. For example, the notion that the government was systematically spying on American citizens was considered fringe before Edward Snowden leaked classified NSA documents. The idea that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq was a mainstream and seemingly credible idea until it wasn't. And the idea that the U.S. economy was headed into a major recession was something like a heresy in 2007.
We are in the midst of a serious financial crisis, and the federal government is responding with decisive action. We boosted confidence in money market mutual funds.
Returning to Chomsky and Herman's propaganda model, it's significant to note that their concerns about the media, their fear that the populace was being misled and controlled, stemmed from their distrust of the powerful institutions that produced news in the pursuit of profit, rather than any distrust of the people, the masses, or the working classes. For Chomsky, the difficulty was always that these media institutions were not built around the principles of free speech and free association, but were rather guided by market forces and the political power that arose from those market forces. Why is it then that when the 90s came along and the internet was born, the diversity of expression brought with it concerns about the abuse of free speech, along with the celebration of the coming cyber utopia? Why was the internet referred to as the Wild West? As far back as the days of AOL, there were concerns about all manner of abnormal and abhorrent communications being passed back and forth online. Can the general population be trusted? Perhaps Chomsky is not the best source to turn to in order to answer that question. Instead, we might turn to the original writer of the phrase that Chomsky borrowed for his book with Herman. The idea of manufacturing consent came from the journalist, political commentator, and amateur philosopher Walter Lippman, whose book, Public Opinion, was where the term was originally coined. According to Lippman, there's a tension at work in democratic societies, a contradiction between the need for control through norms and the desire for liberty. When Walter Lippman wrote about manufacturing consent, he was advocating for it not because he was a conservative. In fact, he was, for a time, a socialist. Rather, Lippman argued that consent was always manufactured or produced by systems of power. The question in a democratic society wasn't whether information and expression would be free and open, but rather by what mechanism would information and expression be controlled or limited. Lippman wrote, quote, "The creation of consent is not a new art. It is a very old one, which was supposed to have died out with the appearance of democracy. But it has not died out. It has, in fact, improved enormously in technique, because it is now based on analysis rather than on rule of thumb." And so, as a result of the psychological research, coupled with the modern means of communication, the practice of democracy has turned a corner. a revolution is taking place. According to Lippman, the masses are simply epistemically ill-equipped for the task of understanding the society they live in. Given the complexity of the world, the masses, including intellectuals, are little more than a bewildered herd, prone to deploy stereotypes and simplifications for purely pragmatic reasons. The task, then, is to create institutions of education that will inculcate citizens in a republic with a taste for truth as against prejudice. Lippman believed in antiquated ideas like the power of science and reason, even as he struggled with the contradictions he saw in both bourgeois democracies and the dreams of socialist revolutionaries. Lippman aimed at producing the same freedom that Chomsky believes in, but unlike Chomsky, he was a critic of political democracy and Democrats when they claimed that free expression should be the chief aim of a good society. In his book, Public Opinion, Lippman wrote, quote, "The criteria which we should apply to government are whether it is producing a certain minimum of health, of decent housing, of material necessities, of education, of freedom, of pleasures, of beauty, not simply whether at the sacrifice of all these things it vibrates to the self-centered opinions that happen to be floating around in men's minds." Reading Lippman, you get a sense of him as a sincere and rigorous intellectual pursuing solutions to real contradictions in society. So to judge him strictly by the outcome of his thought, namely to judge him based on the fact that his work influenced both the statist policies of FDR and helped to provide, when put into dialogue with conservative liberals like Hayek, the ideological justifications for the neoliberalism that dominates American politics today, would be perhaps unfair to the man. But I think it is not unfair to his thought, and it's worth noting that the ideas of Lippman and not Chomsky are setting the course for most of the left's reactions to the problems that arise around free speech and media communications today. In his book, Other People's Politics, J.A. Smith seems to be on the side with Lippman over Chomsky in one important respect. Namely, he and Lippman agree the mass of men, perhaps specifically men in Smith's view, are not at present rational citizens, but are instead biased, self-interested consumers. The aim of radical politics, then, is not to liberate people as they are, but rather is to create conditions that will improve the populace. Smith writes, quoting the author Andrew Gibson, that the modern belief that the good and properly rational people are the people to come has collapsed into the belief that the people are good and properly rational in themselves right now. Smith goes on to note that the digital environment we occupy does not aim at producing a people to come, because the algorithm gives users content based on what users have liked or done in the past. The algorithm creates bubbles of stasis and, quote, leaves no space for articulating what the future should be, end quote. The dilemma that Lippman struggled with has not been made to disappear by the implementation of neoliberal policies. The combination of centralized state-backed institutions of communication with deregulation and reliance on the market to determine the production of ideas has merely reformulated the same old problems. Here's the situation. Our channel has been censored at a moment when irrational people take themselves to be rational, and the future itself has been canceled. There is a bewildered herd, and I'm a cow. My original intent with this video was to call for the left to renew its commitment to free speech and to argue again that our attempts to censor our enemies can come back to bite us. But as I wrote the script, I found myself being led away from sort of idealist notions about free speech and into the thickness of the problem. And so what I'm noticing now is that simply to call for free speech is really inadequate. What I've done is set up really an excuse for another two-parter. I'll return to this question of being censored, and that's our own moment of being censored, but also to the question of the aim of free speech, what it means for Marx, or what it meant for Marx to embrace a pretty much free speech absolutist position, and how we might conceive of an attempt to get to free expression, but also to actual emancipation as we develop a socialist project. In the meantime, though, let me leave you with this. One observation from Lippman is well worth underlining. When he said that we should judge a government on criteria other than the state's ability to grant its citizens the right to fully express his or her ideas, he was correct. When you add in the central observation from Marx that the ideas we come up with are always in service, at least in a roundabout way, to what we think are our material interests, and that the ruling ideas of any given epoch are the ideas of the ruling class, we can see that creating conditions wherein people can be materially secure, socially connected, and pursue beauty and pleasure along with education and understanding will require us to make material and not merely ideological or even political changes. That is, I repeat myself here. The way to establish free speech is to create the material conditions wherein the self-development of all people is the main aim of our social, political, ideological, and material lives, while holding on to the aims of security, social connectedness, and even the pursuit of beauty. Thanks for watching this Zero Books video. If you enjoyed it, subscribe to this channel and click on the notifications bell so that you'll be alerted whenever we release a new video. You should also consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons get access to our Inside Zero Books podcast every week and can get access to the Zero Books Book Club and help us to continue making online content from the left.